Hi, everybody. I'd like to thank you for coming out for Strive's first ever philosophy Q&A. For those of you who aren't familiar with Strive is personal and professional development inspired by Ayn Rand. I'll turn it over to Sydney.
Hey guys, thanks so much for being here today. We're very lucky Dr. Greg Salmieri is here to answer all of our philosophy and objectivism questions. So Greg, I'll let you introduce yourself and then we can jump into the list.
Hi everyone. I don't know what to say about myself. I'm a philosopher. I teach philosophy at Rutgers University currently. I've taught around a bunch of places, Chapel Hill, Boston University. I'm a fellow with the Anthem Foundation, which supports work on Objectivism and on Ayn Rand, and I'm the co-editor with the late Alan Godhelf of a companion to Ayn Rand, which is a reference volume on her thought that I encourage people to take a look at. Guess that's all I have to say by way of introduction.
Cool. Okay, and then just so you guys know, there's a chat box on the right, so if you have any questions that come up during this webinar that you'd like to have asked, just type those in and we'll be able to see them on this end. But here's our first question. So Greg, is love more than hormones and self-interest?
Well, hormones and self-interest are very different things. So love is, one way to think of love is as an emotion, and the other way to think of it is as the extreme of valuing, of caring about it and holding something as a cherished value. And that involves a certain emotion, right, a feeling you have towards it, but also it involves thinking and being committed to it and acting for it over time and it having a real place in your life. And I think that's the way to think about love. Nothing you feel in an instant, if you could take that instant out of time, is love. Love is, something that's ongoing and across a life or across a period of time. Now, is it more than hormones? Well, I don't think we know everything that hormones do with us, but feelings certainly have a lot to do with the chemicals going on in our brains and in our mind. Everything in our consciousness is somehow or other has a neurophysiological underpinnings to it. But I think it's a mistake to think of it as going one way. There's something that happens in your brain and then you feel a certain way. The way you think affects your brain and vice versa. It's a complicated causal relationship that we don't fully understand between the consciousness we can introspect and what's going on neurophysiologically. So I wouldn't say it's just hormones or just chemicals in that sense. And I think when people ask, is love just hormones, they mean something like, is it just sex urges? Which it certainly isn't. To love someone is more than to want to have sex with them, and not the same thing as to want to have sex with them. I do think sex is an important part of romantic love, and the desire for it is. But also, I don't think that desire is caused just by animal-like responses. Who we want to have sex with and under what circumstances we want to have them has a lot to do with our values, our view of life, what we understand the person to be like. And there are some useful thought experiments that can help you see that, which I could go into if you're not familiar with that idea. And then, is it more than self-interest? Well, that way of asking the question suggests that one has a very narrow view of self-interest, like, self-interest is just about getting laid. So is it more than hormones and self-interest? It sounds like, that. But one's self-interest is what's overall good for one, one's conception of what one wants out of life and what one wants life to be like. And part of what one wants life to be like is to have relationships with other people, for those other people's lives to go well, particularly for people who share important values in common with you, and that's what love's about. So I wouldn't say it's more than self-interest, it's a part of our self-interest. But self-interest has to be understood not just to mean, lining your pockets and voiding your loins.
Yeah, definitely. Could you go into those exercises a little more, just really quickly?
Yeah, well, so first of all, what we're attracted to sexually isn't just bodies and their shapes. If it was, people would be attracted to corpses. And, I mean, some people are, but there's something really wrong with them, right? And we think, what's going wrong with their mind that they don't care that this is a dead person? Likewise, people can get aroused by, sex dolls and things like that, but they pretend that they're not dolls. They pretend that they're people with thoughts and so forth. So what's going on when we want to sleep with somebody, even when we fantasize, is we want a certain kind of interaction with a person, that the person has a certain shape and body and looks a certain way and matches with our preferences is a part of it. But we think of the body type and all the bodily things as ways that a person can be, and who the person is matters to us. And there's a lot of faking involved, pretending people are other than they are, and fantasizing in that way. But who a person is matters to us. And if you think it doesn't, imagine the experience of being with someone sexually, and things are going well, and you're in the midst of the act, and there's a kind of physiological building that takes place, and you're right getting to the high point where it's just what's going to happen is going to happen physiologically, regardless of what you do from now and so forth. And right in that moment, you're in the bedroom and you're intertwined in whatever way you are, and you're noticing things around the room, and you finally see the couple of clues that fit together to let you know that they murdered your father, or some other horrible thing, like this has been a mystery, and you think of it as a movie, it comes together, and you experience that feeling of the orgasm right as you're putting this together. That would not be a pleasant feeling. And it wouldn't be like, well, at least I had that. The very physiological sensation would become abhorrent and horrible to you. I mean, wouldn't it? Or if he was a rapist, or whatever, pick your horrible thing you can learn. It's not like that sensation is valued all alike just for itself, and the person is a dispensable means to it. It's pleasant. There's a kind of physiological pleasure that's there, but you can get that same physiological pleasure by masturbating or by doing a lot of other things. What's so valuable and so wanted about sex is that pleasure, physiological pleasure, forming part of a kind of connection with somebody. And if the person is very different than they think you are, or than you think they are, or then you're pretending to yourself that they are, if it's a kind of self-deceptive relationship, it doesn't have that value. It's disgusting, horrifying, not wanted, not something that you're excited about.
Okay, that makes sense. And so we have one of the questions from Facebook. Isn't the choice...
Let me just give one other example about this. In The Fountainhead, think about Dominique, right? And think of her sleeping with Peter Keating. That should feel gross, right? I mean, that's part of the weirdness of the book, right? It shouldn't be like, well, at least she got to sleep with someone for a few... I mean, there's something kind of gross about that, right? Most of us, I think, feel that way when we think about sleeping with at least certain other people, maybe not everyone, but that's not our chosen partners, but ill, if you really try to imagine it. There's a reason for that ick reaction. What you want isn't just a warm body that's, roughly shaped to these measurements. And
so, I mean, but thinking about it though, aren't there a ton of people who go out and they do just that? Like, if you imagine the stereotypical bar scene or college scene, it seems like there are a lot of people who do that.
Yeah, there are people who are very unselective in who they have sex with, and they're just looking for someone, out at night or out at the bar. But I think there's less in their choices than I think would be ideal for them to get the most out of that aspect of their lives. But there's more behind the choices than you think. There's kinds of gendered interactions that they like, that there's a certain kind of response that they're looking for, that the person is willing to go with them. There's a kind of, or that they're not and they want to force themselves on them, which is horrible, but even that is a kind of, there's a certain dynamic that they want between people, that it's another person is important to it. And which kind of dynamic they want has a lot to do with what kind of person it is who's there at the bar doing it. And then I think also in a lot of these cases there's a lot of faking about what it is that they're getting when they're getting with the person they're getting with. But even when there's not, and if there's something, it's not like, you can picture plenty of things that would happen that would sour the experience because of what they would mean about the person.
Yeah, definitely. Go on.
Oh, Well, I thought as long as we're sort of on the topic of romance, is homosexuality considered moral under objectivism? Is there, can you comment on that issue while we're kind of on this area?
Yeah, so as a philosophy, it shouldn't have, I think, a stance on that. Rand herself had the view that gay rights should be respected by the government and so forth, but that homosexuality was a result of some kind of psychological problem, and possibly one that there was some moral culpability in, and she was, I don't say against it, but she was, put off by it, and she said some unflattering things. I think that's a psychological question, and I think there's not any evidence for that position that I know of. So it was thought widely by psychologists back in the 60s and 70s that that was the case, that homosexuality was a kind of minor mental disorder. And I don't think there was good evidence for it. I think we now know better, or have every reason to believe the opposite. So I think it's perfectly moral. And I mean, I think really that's all there is to say about that. The kind of typical arguments you get that it's immoral has to do with it being like a misuse of the natural purpose of our sexual faculties. And those kind of arguments are arguments you get from the same people who think, really push comes to shove, that sex shouldn't be decoupled from having children. And I think that's clearly wrong on philosophical grounds. For human beings who can choose what to do with their lives and what to do with their bodies, that is, who metaphysically have that ability, we get to figure out what role we want sex to play in our lives, and the sensible role it can play is as a source of great pleasure, as well as a vehicle for having kids if you want kids. So I think that decoupling is a good and natural and human thing. And that includes the creation of sex acts that are not procreative, which needn't be homosexual, I mean just, oral sex and other kinds of sex acts, masturbation, that aren't, you can't have kids by. I don't think we understand what causes some people to be gay and some people to be straight. And I mean, there's the claims that it's biological. I think that there might be some biological components, but I think that's kind of overstressed and was overstressed for political reasons. But that is, if it's biological, then they're a protected group like a race, and therefore I think they ought to be respected under the law regardless of whether it's biological. And I think that view kind of gave a lot of impetus to the "we're born that way" idea. But I don't think we understand what causes sexual orientation any more than I think we understand what causes lots of other sexual preferences people have, that some, one likes blondes or brunettes or taller or shorter people. I think we've got clues as to what factors into that. But at the level of philosophy, I think what we could say is there are a whole lot of issues of taste in sex. What kind of positions, body types, etc. that you like, that differ from person to person. We don't know exactly why or how they come to differ. But we can separate those out from the moral aspect of sex and love, which is, things like you want it to mean something, there has to be consent, and philosophy should only talk about the latter stuff, the morally relevant stuff. And the other stuff is for psychologists and sex therapists and whatever to figure out how these preferences occur, which ones can and can't be changed, and in what cases somebody may or may not want to change them. And I don't mean the change to be specifically with sexual orientation, but for example, if you find that, you're only attracted to Asian people exactly this height or something, that might limit your field a bit, and you might want to work on it. So, but I don't think we know how these kind of preferences come about exactly, and how, if at all, they can be modified. And it's anyway not a moral issue. It's a psychological issue, unless, of course, you find yourself with some preference for something that is immoral, sleeping with children or something like that. And that, too, is, I think, a psychologically caused condition, at least in part, but it's one that motivates you to want to do something that's harmful to yourself and others. And if you have that, you need to figure out how to fix it, or else deny yourself.
Yeah, definitely. So we have
but there's no reason to think that liking other men or other women or, you know, preferring black people to white or vice versa is anything like that.
Okay. Yeah, definitely. We actually have a live question from Ian now. And Ian asks, what is the fundamental difference between intellectual property rights and physical property rights? What's the moral justification for limiting the term of intellectual property rights to a duration that's sometimes less than the lifespan of the creator?
Yeah, so there are two issues. What's the difference between them? What's the reason for limiting the time span of intellectual property rights, and how do you tell how long to limit them to? So, and then whether it should be more or less than the lifespan of the creator comes under that second question. So there are a few differences. One that's relevant to the limiting of the time that Rand stresses in her article, Patents and Copyrights, is that if you have property in an object or in a piece of land, right, it's a specific, concrete, individual item that you have that requires upkeep to maintain its value, right? The land things can happen to it, and you have to do work to keep the thing valuable. You have to, so there's a kind of upkeep and maintenance. You have to keep on using your mind to maintain the value and doing actual physical work to maintain the value of the object. And that's not the case if you have a copyright on a work of literature or a patent on a method. And because of that, in fact, a finite single act of production in intellectual property, if there were no term limit, would give you a claim on a potentially infinite amount of wealth into the future. Whereas in the case of other forms of properties, chattels, that is, items you own, or real property, that is land, there's a kind of ongoing act of production and maintenance that's commensurate with and lasts as long as the valuing of the property, and there's such a thing as abandoning it, and if you abandon it, then at a certain point it stops being your property, and there's evidence of what counts as abandonment and so forth. So that's at least one of the reasons, and I think it's the primary one for this difference in law. Now, if that is the reason, then we need some way in law to figure out how to set the limit and what kind of time frame and what kind of continued work is involved in different kinds of intellectual property and so forth, whether there is, and also what amount of time of exclusive rights to it is required for a creator to reap the full value of what he's created. And I don't know how to solve that problem. I think it's something that you'd have to have experts in different types of inventions and literature and the kinds of material uses of literature think about and testify before Congress on and so forth, and then laws would have to be made. But one thing to keep in mind with this and any other issue like this about time limits on things or limiting, it's not like there's a right answer in nature. And then we have to discover what that answer is. And if we were like a year or two off in either direction, we'd be getting the wrong answer. It's the same as with the voting age. You have to have voting, I think, in a free society. It's part of what keeps the society free, and I think it's necessary as a matter of political principle that there be voting for personnel and such like this in a republic and in a moral society. And you can't have toddlers vote. And you also can't, you say you can't vote until you're 97. It has to be something like competent adults can vote. But then when is that? Is it 18, 17, 21, 23? It's not like there's some right answer, and any society that doesn't have that right answer is wrong. A lot of things in reality are continuous. Human beings, fade in with our abilities and fade out, and we need to put a kind of bright line in the law on those things so that everybody knows what it is, and there's no room for discretion on the part of officials so that they can say, oh, you're too immature, Grant, but Sydney can vote, even though you're the same age. So they need to, we need to put a bright line in the law on something that's continuous, and there are a lot of, optionality as to where that line is. And I think it's the same thing with intellectual property rights. It would be wrong if all inventions, the descendants of the family had the right to them in perpetuity, so that we'd still be having to pay royalties to the inventor of the wheel for anything that rolled, and it would be wrong if it lasted 10 minutes, so that nobody could ever possibly profit off their invention. But what the right time is, I think there's probably a range of good right times. I think it's got to be years. I think it can't be centuries. And thinking about the lifespan of the creator is probably a good place to start for thinking of how long it should be. But it shouldn't be exactly as long as the creator is there, because then you can't contract with somebody, because who knows when they'll die. So you have to think about ways to do it, and there must be different ways that it's done in the law. And I'd start by looking at what the laws are and what rationales were given for them in different countries, the UK and America in particular, where I think there's pretty good property right protection.
And so do you think that, say there are heavy medical advances and then our lifespan extends to 200 years, but then that could change that law? Or do you think just the act of creating would mean that there's kind of a definite time limit that we haven't figured out?
Oh, I think this kind of thing has to be considered in view of things like how long a human lifespan is. And if that changes significantly, that might lead to changes in law on this. And also other things like how fast the pace of technological advancement is. And these are laws that I think are things that have to be made up by a legislature and revised from time to time, as in fact they are.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
So I have an interesting question. What is the greatest or the strongest argument against objectivism or an objectivist principle, and how would you refute it?
Yeah, that seems like a bit of an
I know it's a weird question, but
unfair question, so to speak, because I'm not going to be the best presenter of arguments against something I think. I think the issues about free will are, in a way, the hardest one. We just had a conference on this. But it's in another way the easiest one. That is, I think free will is self-evident. I think if you know where to look in your own mind, you can find it, and if you sensitize yourself to it. But it's just for that very reason, it's not something that's really established by argument. You can have arguments that show that free will is presupposed by other beliefs you have, but things that are that kind of basic, it's always possible to jog around in a discussion. So I don't think it's really an objection to objectivism, and I don't think there's an argument against it, but I think it's like a kind of fundamentally basic difference in the world that's pre-argumentative. And I think it's possible to know which answer is right, but very difficult to convey that knowledge to someone else if they're not looking in the right place. And I think that's true with a few other very deep kind of philosophical things on the level of axioms. And there's an issue when you have questions like that of one just has to be honest and think, am I fooling myself here, and how can I know I'm not fooling myself? And but there's not going to be some kind of algorithm for doing it. So I think free will is like that. And there are a lot of, the objections are kind of technical, and there are a lot of them I'd be happy to talk about, but it seems weird to just kind of produce them and then try to knock them down. I mean, I deal with a bunch of them in the companion and in other writings, but it doesn't seem like a good conversational practice to set something up and knock it down. I don't know that I'd be giving the fairest presentation of it. It's better for you guys who want to know that to ask people who think objectivism is wrong what they think are the strongest arguments against it, and then ask someone who doesn't think that to how they would answer them. And I'm happy to do that.
Okay. And we have another live question. Hypothetically speaking, is objectivism robust enough to withstand the loss of free will? And in what ways would this refutation affect the philosophical system?
Well, what's not robust enough to withstand the loss of free will is human life, choice, self-direction. So I think if one understands that there is free will, and one understands the reason, why we think there is, then it becomes kind of inconceivable what it would be like to discover that there wasn't. But if there wasn't, it's just not clear what would be true instead. So it's a bit like asking the question, you know, if 3 were 17, what would the next number after 3 be? Would it still be 4, or would it be 18? And what would 3 plus 47 be? You know, when something's so, if you discovered you were wrong on something so fundamental, you can't just say, well, then here's how everything would fit into place if I just change this one thing. The reasons, all the habits of thought that go along with believing one has free will, you'd have to think, well, what becomes of those? Can we still be right or wrong about things? Can we still check things? Is there still an important difference between evasion and focus, or is that all, you know, what's true instead? And I don't think until you answer that you can say what would be true. And it's not just an issue of objectivism. I mean, could we praise or blame people for things? Could we praise or blame ourselves? Do we still need methods? Or is it okay to just go by your feelings willy-nilly? I don't think you can know what would be true if the world was that different. And this goes for, in general, I think it's a mistake to take systems of thought and say, if I changed this one element, what would stay? I mean, you can do it as an intellectual exercise sometimes, and if they're local enough elements, you can accomplish something by it. But if you're wrong about something that you're certain of, but it turns out to be wrong, you can't know in advance what else will have to change. You know, you have to cross that bridge when you come to it.
Okay, that makes sense. Sydney, do you have another question, or do you want me to run something?
I have one. I thought we could shift to politics a little bit. So one of the questions we have is how compatible objectivism is with liberalism and conservatism.
Well, liberalism and conservatism, and all the words we use in politics today, are kind of fluxy in their meaning, or fluctuating in their meanings. And I don't think they really represent political philosophies. If you take all the things that liberals hold, it's not clear that they belong together. There's some one principle that they stand under. And likewise for conservatives, I mean, why should wanting guns to be unregulated, but reproductive choices to be regulated, and favoring smaller government, but also having voter ID laws? I mean, what do these things all have in common? They don't have anything in common other than there are some historical facts that created a coalition of people who share overlapping sets of these views, and then they talk other people into others of them. So I think all these terms like conservative, liberal, and I also think libertarian is in the same category, have to be understood not as ideological positions, but as sort of factions or coalitions. And I don't think, was the question, is objectivism compatible with them, or what was the question?
Yeah, how compatible is it?
I think it's not compatible with, for each of those coalitions, there are certain points on which objectivism agrees, but you know, there are much greater differences than agreements. So I think Rand was, and I think objectivism as a philosophy implies that one should be, in favor of the right to abortion, for example, which today liberals are in favor of, but also in favor of elimination of all or most regulations on business, which liberals are opposed to, and supposedly conservatives are for, although it turns out they're not really in practice. It implies that you should be for trade, which until a few years ago, most of the liberals and conservatives were for, and now a lot of them are against. Another sign that there's no real essence to what these factions stand for. So I think if one's thinking about what position one should take, even putting objectivism aside, if you're just thinking about what's true, on any political issue, the categories of liberal and conservative are useless. There's no principle there that can guide you. You should just jettison them from your mind and think about what's true. And objectivism gives you principles that I think are the right guides for that, and you can think about whether they're the right principles, and if you think they're not, find some others. But I don't think liberalism and conservatism are helpful concepts there. What they're useful concepts for is understanding what kind of coalitions we have in our culture right now that you might have to deal with in deciding who to vote for, or predicting what will happen if one guy gets in versus the other, or who you can make rapprochements with to try to advocate for some issue. If you are concerned about abortion rights and you want people to help you fight to preserve abortion rights, likely you'll want to turn to more liberal people and ask them for their help. But if you're concerned about persecution of business, likely you're more likely to want to turn to. You'll find more allies among people who call themselves conservative.
Okay. And we have a follow-up question on that from Jennifer, and she asks, when listening to liberal, conservative, or libertarian opinions, what types of quote-unquote reasoning should stand out as red flags to someone who's trying to think objectively?
What kind of reasons should, in other words, like, what should you be suspicious of when listening to a liberal? What should you be suspicious of when listening to a conservative, and what a libertarian?
What types of reasoning, when you see them, the type of argumentation they take, what types of argumentation should you be wary of?
So since they're not all one thing, that if there are different strands in each of these, there are a few. In conservatism, I think you should be wary of appeals to tradition. Things are not good because they're old, or even because they're what our founders said. Although, if you think our founders were good as I did, that's a reason to think about it. You should be wary of appeals to religion, to any kind of traditional institution like the family. Sometimes, some things about families are good, but there's a lot of appeal to family values. Things aren't as they used to be. To the kind of projection of some previous time when everything was all well and good, and then it got muddled and bad, and now we have to get back there. That's a kind of fixture of conservative thinking, and I think it's not a valid way of thinking. And unfortunately, particularly recently, to racism and nationalism, to those others who are not like us or part of us, and a kind of dichotomies between us, which means something like white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, or people who have 4 grandparents born in America or something, and those others who are, from Mexico or something. So appeals to tradition, appeals to religion, appeals to kind of just old institutions or familiar institutions, and appeals to racism or nationalism. And if you want to sum that up, appeals to the familiar. In the case of liberalism or liberals, I think what one should be wary of is the tendency to read everything as in terms of struggle between classes, or struggle between collectives, where those collectives are defined on either economic or racial lines, or some other group identity lines like women or gays or something like that. So liberals are always reading, or leftists, let's call them, are always reading everything in a kind of Marxist way through not individual values and interests, but the competing interests of different classes and marginalized groups. And I mean, there are people who are marginalized for bad reasons, and one has to be sensitive to that. But there's an overemphasis on that, and there's a kind of idea that that's what drives all of history, and that's what drives all political decisions, and that's what's important. So there's a kind of taking the idea of protecting these certain groups out of context and reifying the groups over the individuals. An overemphasis on victimhood. And being in the victim status as kind of ennobling and giving you special prerogative. That's one thing on the left. Another, recently especially, is a kind of focus on equality. particularly of income equality and being concerned about inequality. And you could read Yaron Brook and Don Watkins' material on that to get a sense of what the issues are there. And a general kind of anti-Western civilization and anti-human being bias. Anti-human being bias in environmentalism, but anti-European American civilization. I mentioned the right as having a kind of racist streak now. In part, that's always been there, but in part it's a kind of defensive reaction against the left vilifying white European males for, allegedly being the oppressors of everyone else. So one wants to look for that kind of thinking. Not thinking about what ideas are true and what institutions are good for human beings, but thinking about the hegemony of the patriarchy and of colonial powers and so forth. So a tendency to view things through those lenses, which is part of multiculturalism. And then the other one is a kind of anti-business bias. And for libertarians, you get a lot of the biases from the left and the right come in, different ones in different people. So you get these kind of paleo-libertarians, as they call themselves, who are often racists and have the worst kind of white nationalist stuff, and a lot of them have gone to be part of the alt-right now. But also you have the so-called left libertarians who really emphasize the class stuff that the liberals do. The other element that's central, that you find a lot in people who call themselves libertarians and somewhat in people who call themselves conservatives, is being anti-government and anti-establishment, as though everything would be fine, but there's this imposed government on us and it does things wrong and makes things bad, and all we have to do is get rid of it and then everything will be fine because a spontaneous order will emerge and all will be well. I don't mean that the concept of spontaneous order, which comes out of Hayek, is always wrong or bad, but there's this idea of the government is an imposition on us and we'd be better with as little of it as possible. Ideally, we'd be in anarchy. But it's a kind of view where having government is a kind of original sin. Everything would just be fine all on its own, and then this is imposed on us and it screws things up. And that's really, really wrong. Having a functional, good, rights-respecting society is an achievement, and it requires a government. And the point isn't just that we should reject anarchism, but we should reject anarchic ways of thinking. So ways of thinking that are like, all we need to do is drain the swamp or get rid of the establishment or get rid of these bad people and then everything will be okay. All we need to do in foreign policy is to get rid of these dictators and then everything will be okay. That's just never true. It's never the case that the problem is, unless you're talking about a dictatorship, that there's just this government or just these tyrants or dictators that are oppressing people and all we have to do is get rid of them. What you need for a culture or a society to be better, for a government to be better, for people to be safer and freer, is positive institutions that recognize and protect rights. It's not just getting rid of something bad, it's building something good. It's reforming and improving the systems that it protects and respects rights and freedom. So the thing that you have to be focused on with libertarians is that they're typically anti-state rather than pro-freedom. And that comes out in lots of ways, even in the ones who aren't actually anarchists. They're focused on what the state is doing wrong, not on what it needs to be doing right, and on how what it's doing is in conflict with that.
Okay, and we have another question that can kind of follow up and leads on to that. There's a quote by Rand and then a question that follows. So the quote, she says, whether his neighbor's intentions are good or bad, whether the judgment's rational or irrational, whether they're motivated by justice or ignorance or prejudice or malice, the use of force against one man cannot be left to the arbitrary decision of another. But if Rand believes in reason and a man's capacity to think, she upholds all of those in personal responsibility, how can she say that any one man using force would be arbitrary? If he's motivated by an objective sense of justice, can't he implement the use of force on his own?
Well, you have to think about, if you imagine a situation in which you have two people who don't live together in any kind of a society, but say they, each live on the opposite sides of a deserted island, and they don't speak the same language as one another, but they occasionally encounter each other and have to make terms of how to deal with one another. Or you have three people like this on the island. They're not, involved in a community or a project of living together, but they occasionally encounter one another. And then one of them does something wrong to the other, or that the other thinks he's done something wrong to him. I think, yeah, that individual can think objectively about what really happened here, what would be an appropriate response, what would be the right way to retaliate against it, and so forth. But once we're talking about people who aren't only occasionally encountering each other, people who are living in the same area such that they're constantly going to be overlapping and their interests are constantly going to be affecting one another in different ways. One can't think about how to retaliate for seeming harms done outside of the context of how to make it clear to all the other people there that that's what's going on. So if I'm living with 100 people and I take it into my head that you've stolen my sheep and now I'm going to retaliate against you, I could be as objective as I want and perfectly rational in concluding that you are the one who stole my sheep, that a reasonable penalty for stealing a sheep is for me to take 2 of your sheep back and whatever and lock you up for a year. But if I then go out and go to your farm and take 2 sheep and try to tie you up and drag you back with the sheep to my lair, and everybody else here is seeing this happen, right? I have not made what I'm doing objective to them. I have not made it clear to them so that they don't know that I'm doing the right thing. And if I'm really being objective in my own thinking about this, I realize that by not doing that, by not making it clear to all the other people that what I'm doing is justified, I am not actually acting objectively, because I'm now menacing all these other people by, for all they know, just capriciously imprisoning you. So the first thing I should realize that I have to do is make a case to everybody around that what I'm doing is proper retaliation, is proper defense of my own rights, so that they properly don't view me as a threat. I think that's the first step in our thinking of what would be required to be objective here. It's not just myself knowing, but being able to prove it to everybody else who has an interest in what I'm doing, because it threatens them for me to be acting forcibly upon you. They have reason to fear me. But as soon as we start realizing how difficult it is to prove things and how much possibility there is for disagreement, it becomes clear that even that isn't enough, my making a case to everybody. Because what I really have to do to retaliate objectively in a context where I'm living with other people in a society and want to be, is I have to not just make the case to the other people, but I have to submit that case to them for their approval. I have to say only if I proved it to other people to their satisfaction, so that they really know that I'm not a threat to them by taking this retaliatory action, can the retaliatory action be taken. And all of us have that need to do that. And so the only way to do it is to create some kind of institution whereby nobody is the judge, jury, and executioner himself, but there's a publicly accessible mechanisms that everybody can access for justice. And once we recognize the need for that kind of an institution to exist, and for us all to submit our desired retaliations to that institution, for it to make the decisions and do it, rather than doing it unilaterally, then in seeking justice, or what we might call justice, independent of that, we're acting arbitrarily. we're acting capriciously, we're acting non-objectively. Because what real justice is against somebody who's attacked you in a context where you're living with other people and you have to be wary not to accidentally attack them in seeking your vengeance. What real justice is in that context is going through some kind of system of due process where there's a check on your own ability to retaliate.
Okay, awesome. And we've got a lot more live questions now, so I think we can go ahead and jump over to a few of those. So, switching gears a little bit, do you have any advice for people seeking to engage in intellectual work as a hobby versus as a career?
I haven't really thought much about that. What would be different if it's a hobby versus a career? I mean, one thing that's important at any level, but maybe especially important if it's a hobby, no, it's important at any level equally, is to be aware of, to take the work seriously, and to be aware that it's a lot of work to know things, and to know what work you've done and what you haven't, what things you're sure of and what you're not, both within philosophy but also any specific views you might have in psychology or about the state of the culture or what's the greatest artwork ever or whatever it is. Be clear what you know and what you don't, what things you're, how confident you are reasonably of each of your conclusions, and don't get drawn into defending something or taking some position because you think you're supposed to, or that's the objectivist view or the view of whomever you admire. Just have defined projects of what you're looking into, what you're trying to prove if you're trying to prove something, what you know and don't know, and stick to those and expand them and change them as time goes on, but be purposeful and be aware of what you do and don't know and aren't trying to figure out, rather than taking it upon yourself to know everything or defend everything anyone else has said. So that's true in general for everyone, but it's the less time you're spending on intellectual pursuits, the more it's a thing you're doing on the side, the more constrained you're going to be in how much you can figure out, in how much you can master, and so the more selective you'll have to be about it.
Okay, awesome. And then, let's see. So we have several from Facebook then. How can objectivism claim to have solved the problem of induction? Doesn't the fact that the objectivist epistemology relies so heavily on generalization undercut the objectivist view of knowledge?
Rely on what?
That it relies on generalization.
Generalization. Well, I don't know that objectivism does claim to have solved the problem of induction. Rand didn't claim that. I don't claim it. Leonard Peikoff has a theory of induction, and Dave Harriman wrote a book presenting it, and it's based on objectivism, and you might think that solves the problem. It's not. I think we have to start with what is the problem of induction, right? And it doesn't have an exactly clear specification. So we want to think about what is the problem, and then whether Dr. Peikoff solved it or Dave has. And I think how you specify the problem, what the problem is, changes that. So if the problem is some view that induction is invalid or can't be right, that's a kind of philosophical puzzle or objection to a type of reasoning that, putting aside its role in objectivism, is just crucial to our ability to think and know generally. And so it can't be that induction as such is invalid. I don't think you could even form the concepts induction and form the statement if no generalization was valid. But we have to think about what are the reasons for thinking induction might be invalid, if you're thinking of the material in Hume or the kind of stuff that Popper quotes, right? And then what is the answer to those objections to induction? How do you understand what that form of knowing is, what that type of reasoning is, and how it works? So if it's this skeptical question, there's one, set of answers to it. And, there are different versions of the skeptical question that we can consider. What I think the kind of more legitimate and valid question is how does induction work and what are the standards for inductive reasoning? And that's a question that can be answered at different levels of different levels of detail. And knowledge kind of works in a spiral where you know a little bit of it at some level of detail, and you learn more, and you fill in more detail and more richness to it. I think there are certain kinds of things that you can know about induction without very much sophistication that enables you to make kind of basic level inductions that I don't think it's unique to objectivism to know that. And I think with the kind of a lot of the kind of grunt of the philosophical problem of how does induction work and what implications does that have for how should one do it, I think Dr. Peikoff's theory breaks the back of that problem, so to speak. I think it gives you the essence of the right answer to it, the right perspective to take on induction. But there's, I think, a lot of additional work to do to develop the kind of standards you need to evaluate complex pieces of scientific reasoning, for example, that I don't think has been done yet, or if it has, I don't know it or understand it. So here again, I think we have to think, what question are we asking? Is it a kind of polemical objection, in which case it's an objection that's much wider than an objection to objectivism? Or is it the question of how can we figure out how inductive reasoning works and how to guide it, in which case I think objectivism does have some insights to offer, as do some other philosophers that came before. Francis Bacon, I think, certainly does, and others.
Okay, awesome.
So, you know, some other time if we do one of these again and someone wants to ask that in more detail, we can ask more specific questions about induction.
Yep. And so we have 2 more live questions, but maybe we can probably go over and take some of the Facebook questions and then circle back to these at the end.
Sure, I'm not in a rush.
Yep.
So you want to jump into a Facebook question?
Yeah.
Okay. So why is dependence necessarily an unhappy condition for a person, like with stealing or fraud? So even if you're acting like a parasite, why is living off of other people fundamentally different from living off, you know, the fruits of your own labor? If you're succeeding in your own life, what's the difference there?
So why is it worse to live as a thief than as a farmer?
Right. Why does that lead to an unhappy condition if it's the same outcome of having the things that you need to live?
Well, first of all, it won't be the same outcome. There's a kind of shallower and a deeper way to answer this kind of thing. But if we're talking about clear-cut cases of dependence, like thievery, right, they don't work. Thieves don't succeed. I mean, occasionally they do, but it's really occasional that they actually get by and lead a whole life this way and don't get caught and nothing horrible happens to them. And it's so occasional and so out of your control whether you as a thief get away with it that it's utterly unreasonable to expect it going in. So it's never the rational choice. And this is a point that was made by the philosopher Thomas Hobbes about the fool who said in his heart that there's no justice. And I think Hobbes is right. You're a fool to think you can get away with a life of crime. If we're really talking about a life of, you know, regular criminal life. We can come up with examples like you're a tyrant where maybe it's a little harder to see, but even there I think it's foolish to think you'll get away with it. But that answer is, although I think it's right so far as it goes, it's relatively shallow because it assumes that the ends that you're pursuing by thieving are the right ends. They're ends that will make you happy. So it's having, you know, a full stomach and a harem and a bunch of money or whatever someone who's like this thinks he's going to get by being a thief and a user. But there's more to life than that, and there's more to what enables a human being to survive well over a lifespan than that. There's all kinds of spiritual values that you'll be lacking from such a life, even if by some chance you manage not to get caught and you manage to get away from it with it. You won't be able to have any meaningful interpersonal relationships, for example. You won't have the self-esteem of knowing that your success is due to your own effort because in fact it's due to the happenstance of your not having gotten caught in your thieving, and you're dependent on these other people, and you're therefore worse than them. Because you're not dependent on them in an honest way that you're reliant on someone you trade with. Rather, you are a thing that survives only by victimizing people who could live better without you, and who must be better and more able than you. Otherwise, you wouldn't need them to get your sustenance from. And so you'll always know that and feel that, and that will have an impact on the kind of life you lead, even if the little fragile kind of fragment of a life you've made for yourself never actually existentially comes crashing down. And again, you have every reason to suspect that it will. It won't spiritually be there. It'll spiritually be fragile, and you'll have that fragility and emptiness always there with you. And then finally, an even deeper point is it's not just that what a human life is about and what we need is money, food, relationships, and self-esteem, all like as a kind of list. And so that I'm saying, even if you get the money and the relationships, you won't get even if you get the money, you won't get the relationships and the self-esteem. Rather, what a human life is, and what we value as a human life, and what gives purpose and direction to our life, is an integrated whole that we kind of create for ourselves and pursue. And it's only relative to that, to a life that you conceive of and pursue for yourself, that anything can really have value for you. And that's what you're missing if you don't create and conceive of a life for yourself, but just try to live like an animal by seizing things from other people. There are certain principles that are inherent in constructing a life for yourself. It requires thinking long range. It requires thinking about the range of things a human being needs and what's required to get them. And because of the reasons I already gave, you can't expect to succeed, you won't be able to have self-esteem, you won't be able to have relationships. You can't do that kind of thinking if you're trying to live as a criminal or a tyrant. And so you can't have a life of your own to really be pursuing if you're trying to live as a criminal or a tyrant. And so you have nothing that can have any meaning for you. And I think if you look at people who, so far as we can tell from the who we know are living like this, or who we can suspect are living like this from what we can tell from the outside, there's a real sense of meaningless and emptiness to them. They're petty and vain. They lash out at people. There isn't a sense that they enjoy successes when they have them. You see this in literary characters too. Literary characters are, of course, made up, so they're not real people, and we can wonder if real people are like that. But because they're made up in a way that heightens things that are observable, the author thinks they're real people. Reading literature, gives us a kind of clue of what to look for and how to interpret what we notice in people.
Okay. And so we have another live question. Should rich people have more access and control over public property since more of their tax dollars went to paying for it?
There shouldn't be public property. There shouldn't be public property, so the question shouldn't come up. But insofar as there is, no, I don't think they should. I don't think it compounds the evil of taxation to make people who are taxed more have greater control over anything in the government, because it adds an enforced class, structure to the government, and it gets rid of equal protection. I mean, if you think about what would legitimate public property, if you want to call it that, and I don't think it's really right to think of it as public property, it would be things like the jails, the police cars, whatever the police need to do their business. And to say that because someone's rich or paid more, he should have greater control over what happens in jail, I mean, that's really bizarre. So it only sort of makes sense if you think about, public parks. Should Bill Gates have a bigger say over how the public parks are run than I do because I'm taxed less than him? I mean, it's more his money, so it's more his park, but it's not his park. The money's been taken from him and being on the premise that the government, the people as a whole can do this. And I don't think that's improved any by then adding, and Bill Gates has a bigger say over what the people as a whole do with it. Stop stealing his money and making parks with it. And then if he wants to make a park, he could have total control over it, or get together with me and I'll be a minority investor in the park, and he'll have more control than me.
Okay, awesome. So there's another one. It's a question. It's from
Let me make another point here that's more general than that. When the government does things it shouldn't do, often things that seem like correctives to it make it worse. So take the case of healthcare, right? The government's basically taken over healthcare, and I don't mean Obamacare, although that's another step in it, but basically Medicare and Medicaid took over healthcare in America, so that we don't really have private healthcare anymore, and haven't since the mid-60s. So now take healthcare decisions that are controversial, like abortion. Half of the country thinks abortion should be illegal, and even if they don't think it illegal, they're very uncomfortable with the idea of abortion. They certainly wouldn't pay for abortions. So what about the argument that, well, the federal government or the state government shouldn't fund abortions because that would be taking the money from people who hate abortions and making them finance an abortion, and isn't it wrong to do that? And the answer is yes, it's wrong to do that. But it's wrong to do it in the same way that it's wrong to take money from anybody for anything he might not like, anyone's medical care, the medical care of someone he hates, or for a medical procedure that he doesn't approve of for whatever reason, maybe he's Amish or something, or a Jehovah's Witness, or he just doesn't like medicine. The evil is in the taking over of the money and the taking over of the medical industry. And part of why that's evil is because anything you do like that, anything you do that necessarily involves forcing people to act against their convictions, one kind of conviction or another, either a conviction over what I should do with this money or of what uses of it are right and wrong. If they had the same convictions as the people taking it over, they would do the same thing that the people taking it over are doing, and we wouldn't need to force them. So the whole imposition of force over an area in the economy necessarily violates rights, and it violates people's integrity and principles and ability to decide what to do with their own resources. And you can't stop that or get out of that. If you have the government running healthcare or running education, it's necessarily doing that. But if we now say, and we're going to treat abortion differently because that's a hot button topic, or we're going to treat creation and evolution in schools differently, or any of these things that are for religion or some other specially protected issue, you're not lessening that initial injustice. It's still there that this whole area has been taken over by force, and that people aren't allowed to function by their own reason and values and convictions in it. But you're now compounding it by adulterating the government yet again by adding some other consideration that's extrinsic to the purpose of government into how the government functions, like considerations of people's religious, like religious values into the government. So you're saying, well, because some religious people object to abortion, even though the doctors think that that's the best medical procedure in this situation, we're not going to do it. And you're privileging the people who hold those particular religious views over all the people who have different views over what's right. And it would be the same thing if you privilege rich people's opinions on what to do with parks. The government has to be neutral. It has to be neutral between the interests of different citizens. And we don't fix an injustice that's done by a government program by introducing the additional injustice of privileging some citizens' beliefs or feelings or interests over others.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, Sydney, do you want to grab one of the Facebook ones, or do you want me to?
Sure. I think, did we set a time limit for this too? I do want to be conscious of.
It is technically at an hour. So I'm thinking maybe, Greg, if you want to stick around for like one more, that would be probably the max.
Have we gotten through all the Facebook ones? How many more are there?
Let's see. Right now we have It looks like 5 more Facebook ones.
Let's try to do them quickly.
Okay.
Okay.
All right, so next one. Isn't the choice to live arbitrary? If it is, then how could it possibly serve as the foundation for an objective moral code?
All right, that's a kind of technical one, and it requires some knowledge of what's meant by this context. So let me just say, in Chapter 3 of A Companion to Ayn Rand, I talk about this at some length. So I recommend the final section of that chapter for people who want my views on this. But the concept of arbitrary only arises in a context where there are a lot of different alternatives. And we're imagining different alternative values that you might pursue, and why did you pick this one, life, rather than some other? But what's going on with the choice to life is, in the foundations of ethics, is we're recognizing that the very phenomenon of valuing presupposes a certain thing as one's ultimate value, and one either has it and has values or one doesn't. So it's not like this is arbitrarily chosen over some other value. And then if you're asking, well, is it arbitrary that somebody chooses to live rather than not having any values at all and just, drifts around until they die? Well, what does arbitrary mean in that context? What would be the foil or opposite to arbitrary? And if there isn't one, then what use does the word arbitrary have here? Is it irrational? It's not irrational. Do they have no reason? They have a reason, namely the whole universe is in effect your reason for choosing to live. But it's a different type of reason than you have for something within the context of a life once you have chosen to live. And then let me just make one other point in this connection. These, again, are kind of technical points, so it's easier to do if I'm talking to the person who's asking this question and seeing what his actual concerns are. It's a bit like asking the question, isn't accepting the axiom that existence exists arbitrary? Well, there's no real reason to accept it outside of it. It's kind of a precondition for thinking or accepting anything at all. So if by arbitrary I mean there's no reason outside of itself or something, I guess you could say it is, but that's not what arbitrary means, right? This is a precondition for the whole field of having reasons and thinking at all. And so we can't take a concept from within the realm of logic and reason and thinking, and which means, behaving capriciously rather than following the standards that are inherent in this realm, and then apply it to the very preconditions of entering that realm. And I think the same pattern applies to asking whether the position that gets you into the realm of valuing is arbitrary or not. One other reference on this, in addition to the my chapter in A Companion to Ayn Rand, Chapter 3, I also suggest there's a book called Meta-Ethics, Egoism, and Virtue, which was edited by Alan Godhoff and Jim Leddix, that has several essays on foundational issues in the objectivist ethics. And this issue is discussed, I think, really nicely in there by Darrell Wright in his chapter on reasoning about ends. And there's also, I believe, some discussion of it in a chapter by Irfan Khawaja, the name I forget. So since this is a pretty technical question, if you're asking it, you're probably someone who's thinking about the philosophy pretty technically, and those are some resources for that kind of study.
Okay, awesome. So there's one question that the person says often comes from people of the alt-right movement that he gets, and that is, if we believe that a political system should protect individual rights, and also that a society's dominant culture shapes its political life, doesn't it threaten our rights to allow hordes of immigrants into the country from regions whose dominant culture rejects the very concept of rights?
Well, where does this concept of hordes of immigrants come? There aren't hordes of anyone coming into America. Immigration is pretty low. It's not like we're being overrun by people from someplace else. So, I mean, if you actually imagine like the Mongol hordes flooding over, yeah, then you'd have an invasion, and that would be the case. But you get this rhetoric of hordes, and it's totally, I think, disconnected from reality. Now, there are certain areas of the world at certain times where I don't think it's disconnected. So you have a migrant crisis right now in Europe of all these people coming from Syria en masse all at once, and I think there were real questions about what to do about that and how to handle it and whether they should be let in and where they should be put. But we don't have anything remotely like that happening in America now. So I think the question is prejudicial. Now, if we go back and say what I think is a really serious question, how can a country deal with the issue of immigration, given that the people of that country value their institutions, and yet the institutions are based on the culture, and people coming in can change the culture, right? Not hordes, and they're all running, and they're going to ransack us, and there'll be a taco cart on every corner, and whatever. But just put more abstractly, I think there is a question about that, and I think you need to answer it. I think you need to separate citizenship from residency. So I think somebody's coming into the country is not the same thing as they're becoming a member of the country who gets to vote. And I think you need to have fairly strict citizenship requirements if somebody needs to be here for a very long time, and maybe have sponsorship from a citizen, and one has to think about what it should be that makes it the case that we don't get people becoming citizens very quickly. And we don't have more than maybe a certain number of people from outside becoming citizens per year. I think there are kind of difficult questions about the naturalization and immigration process that one could ask. And I don't know all the answers to those. But the way to think about that is in a context where you're pro-immigration, you think we want more people. We want the kind of people who want to come here. And how can we devise a system whereby they can come here, as many of them as possible, and can eventually become part of our nation and become, they or their children become voters? What has to happen in order for that to happen? And how can we, what systems and institutions do we need to put into place? And in fact, I think America's been very successful in that respect. We've had tons of immigration, and we had a lot more immigration back at a time when we were a freer country than we have now. I mean, there was hardly any limit on immigration until the Second World War, or rather until the First World War, I mean, in the 19th century. And the country did not get worse over the course of the 19th century. By and large, it got better politically. There are certain ways in which it got worse and certain ways in which the overall trend was not to the bad. And insofar as there was a trend to the bad, it wasn't because of the huddled masses yearning to breathe free who got here and decided that they wanted to pass the Sherman Antitrust Act. It was European-educated intellectuals who were, born in America and went to universities there. So there were historical models, and look to them for how to do it.
So the other, I have another one. So how could it be self-interested for a starving person to respect the rights of the person whose bread he needs to steal? We have to be alive to pursue our interests after all, so how could starving to death in the name of other people's rights comport with that?
I don't think it is. I mean, if you're literally starving and it's an emergency, then I don't think there's an issue of rights. Or rather, the issue of rights applies to what you do when you stop starving. So if you're imagining some situation where, you had been kidnapped by people and left in a room, and you escape, or by a stroke of luck you get out, and you find yourself in a neighborhood where everything's closed and there's nothing to eat, but there's a bakery, and you're going to die before morning if you don't have a loaf of bread, and you can get it, then take the loaf of bread, and then in the morning pay back the baker and say, I was in this situation, and I'm sorry I broke your window. So if you imagine some kind of emergency where somehow you just suddenly find yourself starving, and there's some guy's piece of bread that you can take and you'll live the night and otherwise you won't, then take the bread, and there's no issue of rights there except how you make recompense after the fact. But the idea that this has some kind of political significance, these kinds of situations, suggests that people are all the time finding themselves in these situations, and that it never happens. I don't know of an actual case like that, right? If we have actual people who are starving, who didn't just pop into the world suddenly or pop out of some, terrorist's lair that they escaped from and now they're very hungry, how did it get to be the case that they're in this emergency situation where but for someone else's piece of bread they'll starve? And people just don't find themselves in that situation very often, at least not in a free country. So we'd have to then actually consider cases about what's justified in this or that situation. And people are not normally perpetually starving. If you're perpetually starving, then we have to ask how you got into that situation. I mean, they are if they're in Somalia or someplace where there's no government and there's no way for people to run businesses, and but if you're in a situation where it's more than an acute emergency, then you need some long-term plan where you're going to be able to stop starving, not just right now, but in general. And making a victim of the people around you who aren't starving isn't going to help you do that. So you're going to have to, find the guy who has bread and say, I'm starving, and I'm always starving because I've got no job and no way to get bread. You have bread. Is there something I could do, for you where you'll feed me? And, that works. That's how people get fed.
Yeah. So next question, this one and then one more. So what can we say about the appearance of tension between virtues as long-range rules for flourishing and the prospect that violating them in any given instant might serve one's interests? And does a sort of question like this, the questioner gets this question a lot from people who discuss with, does this sort of question reveal a flaw in the person asking its conception of virtue or interests or both?
I wouldn't necessarily say it reveals a flaw. A kind of achieved perspective on the different virtues to see how they're the means of recognizing what's in your self-interest, of what's good for you, and how they're necessary means of understanding what's good for you even in the moment. So if you're thinking that there are conflicts, and if it's true that there aren't, as I think, then it's because you're not understanding the virtues that way. And for each individual virtue, you have to understand it that way. But again, that's not something like you should come out of the box just hearing a few words about virtue and have that perspective. So what we'd want to do is talk through any kind of particular cases of conflicts that there might be and see why it's seeming that there's a conflict between this principle, which is the virtue in this case, and whether it's true that there's a conflict. And I think if one does that for a number of cases, one starts to get the principle and then starts to see how there aren't conflicts. And that the seeming conflicts are cases of either misunderstanding the context you're in or misunderstanding the requirements of the virtue. But it's something that we really have to do virtue by virtue. So we just did it with the one of, the principle of following right and, stealing someone's bread. And you'd have to do it case by case a number of times, and then you kind of come to automatize the perspective on the virtue, where it just doesn't seem like there are these conflicts anymore, and where people raise conflicts, one can see one's way through them. But that's again an achieved perspective. Not like there's something wrong with you if you don't have it, and that is the achieved perspective. If I'm right, that that's the right answer, right? Which you have to judge for yourself by working through the cases. Maybe if we have another call, people can present specific cases like this where they think they'd be better off being dishonest, but
yeah.
Or Grant, whoever has the next one.
All right, so this is last question. If objectivists do not believe that fetuses have rights, do they also deny that infants have rights?
So I'm a little bit thrown by it being objectivist. I feel like it's now a sociological question. I have to survey people. I'll tell you what I believe. As with the issue of voting age and things like that, right, which I talked about earlier, where I don't think there's an answer built into reality that we just discover, but rather there's a kind of set of facts that make it necessary for us to draw lines somewhere within a range of places. I think the same thing is true in the case of rights and where they begin. So human beings fade in, right? We start as blastulas that are really nothing like fully functioning adult human beings. And gradually we become larger clumps of cells, and there's a heart, and then little organs and so forth, and but it's still similar to the embryo of a elephant or a fish. And then you have something that looks like a human being and can have a tiny one and has some kind of rudimentary feelings, but is still can't live except insofar as it's in the woman's uterus. And then you have a newborn baby, which can't do too much more than the thing in the uterus can do, but can do a little bit more, and it is physically detached. And then gradually it gets a little bit more knowledge, and you get a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old and a 5-year-old, and suddenly you're 26 and on a on a conference call, right? So there's not some line where suddenly the thing is a human being. Human beings fade in. That's just what it is to be something that develops over time. So you have to think about, when we're thinking about rights and what has them, what is the principle of rights and why do we have it? And the principle of rights is about how entities that interact with one another by reason and persuasion, and that need to interact with one another by reason and persuasion, what spheres each has where each must be understood by the others to be in charge. So that it would be a violation of the other person to for me to enter the sphere of his rights, right, where he has freedom of action. So that's a principle that applies primarily to adult functioning human beings who can make contracts and deals with people. But we also know that we don't start out that way, and we get to be that way. We kind of fade in, and we start to have some of those abilities earlier than others. And that in order for us to develop those abilities at all, we need certain conditions. So once one takes a kind of progressive developmental view of human beings, one recognizes that to treat a human being understood primarily as the adult thing in a way that respects his rights, one has to realize that he gets to that level through a series of transitions. And certain rights come online fully at other times, and other ones have to be there in kind of attenuated forms, or in forms where they're not fully able to exercise them, but they have to be respected earlier. So if you look at a child like a 5-year-old, the child can clearly make choices. He's not the same thing as an animal. He's able to think, he's open to persuasion, but he's unable to make decisions for the whole course of his life. And when you think about the principles that the reasons why the principle of rights applies in general, they apply to the child, but not quite in the same way as they apply to the adult. And you can go back younger and younger. Now, there's no bright line at which point they begin to appear. So what do we do about that? I think we have to take one of the bright lines, we have to draw a line, and we have to take the natural and best places to draw the lines are at things that are distinct major changes in nature. And those are, I think the main one is birth. So I think the place to draw the line for where we start recognizing rights, where we start applying it, is at birth, and that we think of things that are born, people that are born as people under the law, who are now in the process of, they're already a person and they're in the process of developing into a full-blown agent who has, whose rights we treat in the normal sense rather than they're in trust or in attenuated forms. And before that, we treat it not as a person at all. But if some society has a slightly different view, that is, they treat the thing as a person with rights, in the 9th month of pregnancy, or they don't treat it as a person until a month after it's born. I think there are reasons why drawing the line at birth is the right place. It's the best place to draw it, but I don't think that's clear-cut wrong. It's like if you had the voting age a little too high or a little too young, or anyway higher or younger than I think is the best place. And technological concerns and what we can tell about someone and what kind of birth defects or diseases they might have or might not be susceptible to, and how high infant mortality is, and all kinds of things like that, I think factor into why it's right to draw the line where we draw it. So if you look at ancient civilizations where there was some infanticide and it wasn't illegal because they weren't considered full-blown people until a few months in, I don't think we can say about them those are evil civilizations because of that. I think that was not a crazy view in their context. But for most contexts and for ours, I think the place to draw the line is at birth, because it is a clear division. And prior to birth, the fetus can't be interacted with at all without interacting with the mother. And the mother is a clear-cut, obvious paradigm case of a human being with rights. And there's nothing you can do with the fetus, or to, quote, protect the fetus, that doesn't potentially endanger the mother. And so I think drawing the line before birth would result in real impositions on the mother's rights, and that shows that it's the wrong place to draw the line. But on the other hand, I think you should draw it as early as you possibly can, because you're empowering other people to make decisions to possibly kill someone who might be a human being and who might have, there might be specific ill motives to do it and so forth. So that fixes us on birth. Before birth, you're interfering with the mother, and at birth is the earliest time it can be. And then whether it's when the head crowns or when the umbilical cord is cut or whatever it is, these are, I think minor things for a law to address.
Okay.
But other objectivists might have somewhat different views on that. Rand's own view was that the clear-cut case was the first trimester. And she was writing in a context where abortion had been illegal, and she was saying it should be legal, and it's wrong that it's illegal. And one could quibble about the later parts of pregnancy, but in the first trimester, it clearly ought to be legal. And I think that the thing can't think it's nothing like a human being other than that it is human DNA at that point. And I think there's no non-mystical reason to think something in the first trimester has rights. If we're talking about an 8-month-old fetus, then that's, I think there's more room for debate there.
Okay, awesome. Well, that wraps up all the questions that we have from Facebook and live. So, Greg, is there any way that people who have any follow-up questions or want to ask you a question can reach you?
Well, I have a Facebook page. They could message me on Facebook or send me an email. But I think, we'll probably do more of these in the future, I hope, either with me or with other people. So why don't you guys set up a way for people to submit questions, and, I'll come on when there's a critical mass of them at some point again.
Exactly. I was just going to say, if you guys have more questions from this Q&A, or if you come up with other questions in the near future, please email them to info@striveclubs.org. It'll be really helpful for us in planning more of these types of Q&As. So, yeah.
Okay. Thanks, everyone. And I didn't really get to meet any of you who are behind the chat box, but thanks for asking questions, and I hope this was helpful.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for doing this, Greg.
Bye.
Yeah. See you guys later. Have a nice night.